Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. If it sounds like there's a bowling alley on Friday night in the room, that's because we've got some storms coming through. There's heavy rain, there's going to be lightning and thunder, so I apologise for any audible evidence of that. And I've got Luna on the desk here with me. I'll just give you a quick look at Luna. There she is, she's on the mend, she's healing up after her injuries, and she's being a menace as usual. Back on the desk with you. So this time around I got a couple of vampire movies for you. I'm not doing anything seasonal this time. It's between Christmas and New Year in that weird liminal space when half of the good shops are shut and everybody is spending madly in the post-Christmas sales. I'm not doing that. I'm watching vampire movies. And I've got two from the 1990s for you. One's from 1998 and it's an English one, and the other one is from 1997. It's an American one. Both of them are kind of second tier vampire movies. They're not big films, but they've got features of interest and they were a bit of fun to watch today. So the first one of the two is a 1998 English vampire movie directed by Jake West, who did a few other movies like Evil Aliens and The ABCs of Death. And it's a little piece of very 1990s exploitation called Razorblade Smile, starring Eileen Daly and Christopher Adamson. Now, neither of those names may ring a bell with you, but Eileen Daly's been in a lot of movies. She's kind of gone from various, let's say, adult entertainments into cult entertainments and then back again several times. She's an interesting actress, and in this one she plays a 19th century woman called Lilith Silver, whose paramour is in a duel with a vampire called Sir Sethane Blake, played by Christopher Adamson. She shoots him after he kills her paramour in the duel, and he then bites her on the neck and turns her into a vampire. And now, 150 years later, Lilith and Sir Sethane Blake come up against one another in an operation in and around London. Lilith has set herself up as a hitman kind of thing, or a hit woman in this case. And so she is probably the perfect hit woman. It's difficult to kill her, she's totally ruthless, and she can get a little bit of sustenance on the job. Now, the movie does something really interesting. There's a twist at the end which I like. It doesn't particularly telegraph itself, but it's consistent with everything you hear beforehand, and I'm not going to spoil it for you. But there is a really nice arch and slightly cynical voiceover by Lilith. Right at the start she says, one of the first problems with being a vampire is boredom. After 150 years of being a vampire, things get a little dull, and so you've got to find things to keep yourself amused. She hangs out at a kind of vampire-y goth nightclub called Transylvania, where she discusses the mythology of vampires with wannabe goth vampire people, which is kind of cool. And she sits down and kind of talks through that just to keep herself amused when she isn't doing hits for pay. And as a part of being a contract killer, she's hired to eliminate all the members of a mysterious Masonic Illuminati cult. One of whom is a police officer called Detective Inspector Price, who becomes a kind of low-level annoyance to Lilith. Now, this movie's got a lot of style to it. Lilith has a coffin full of weapons. She doesn't sleep in the coffin, she sleeps in a bed like anybody else does, but she has a coffin full of the tools of her trade, which I find very, very cool. The vampires that we get in this movie aren't your traditional vampires in a lot of ways. They can go out in sunlight, but they have to wear sunglasses because that's cool, and also protect their eyes from the sunlight. And Lilith, being a buxom lady,
Busty substances,
is quite popular in bed. She has a lover that she's taken who is in the business. She also seduces and later sups on one of the wannabe goth vampire women. So she's very even-handed as far as sharing her favours. And one of the other things too is that she dresses for most of the movie. Don't knock the camera, you dickhead. Luna is going crazy. She's healing from her injuries, and so she's extra energetic because she can't go outside, she can't get the coat off. And Lilith wears latex bodysuits for a lot of this movie because the director Jake West decided that the edgiest thing you can be is a kinky latex fetishist, and so Lilith wears a latex bodysuit for a lot of the movie when she isn't wearing significantly less. Now, this is a fairly low budget movie. It looks like it was shot on 1990s digital media, so the resolution isn't high, but it does give it a certain VHS era ambience that I kind of like. One of the things about it being a fairly low budget movie is they couldn't get the rights to using music, so I think there's some kind of 1990s goth music may have enhanced the movie had it been available, but unfortunately it isn't. But it does have a lot of style to it. It's got a look. I don't think that Jake West is the best director. Some of the camera moves that he does, and there is a lot of handheld camera work in this, aren't as good as the story and the action itself. That is a kind of disappointment. It may be a function of low budgets and short time to shoot the film, but it does have a slight graininess which makes it feel very much a 1990s film rather than something that could be a lot more contemporary. And there were times where I felt like I wanted the film to be in a little more high resolution than it innately is. Now, Christopher Anderson as Sethane Blake is pretty good. He's not a good-looking guy, but he does have a certain charisma and a certain charm playing the master vampire, and all credit to him there. We also get a cameo from a guy who was in a whole bunch of different cult films, including at least one Italian giallo in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. An actor called David Warbeck, who was a New Zealander who went to England and did a whole bunch of things. He did some soft adult films, for instance, like The Love Thief, and he also did a whole bunch of weird Italian action films in the 70s and 80s. This was his last movie. He was dying of cancer when he made the film, but it's nice to see him in there and giving a last hurrah for his career in cult cinema. Now, Eileen Daly, I don't think she's the best actress in the world, but she does have a certain charm and a certain charisma that makes the character work. Her Lilith Silver, even though she has to basically run around all sorts of places wearing a latex jumpsuit, which doesn't lend itself to action sequences particularly well. It's a little bit tight and clingy and restricts movement a bit. But overall, the movie's kind of charming in that 1990s low-budget exploitation horror kind of way. It does have nudity in it. It has a ton of blood. There's a fair bit of blood in both of these movies, which is probably good for vampire films. There's a lot of blood in both of these movies, which is good for them both being vampire films. But in this one, there are some really nice scenes where the action's in black and white, but the blood shows up as bright red. So there is a little bit of digital processing in this film that lifts it above a lot of the similar 1990s low-budget vampire films around. Now, most of the characters in the movie are kind of annoying. The cop in particular is an annoying character who gets beaten up and then keeps coming back to try to take out Lilith Silver, knowing that she's the one doing all these assassinations. But I kind of like it. It's nostalgic for me. It's nostalgia for movies as they were 35 years ago, less than 35 years, but in that kind of mid-late 1990s time, when I was still buying VHS tapes rather than starting on DVDs, which I didn't do until around the turn of the century because they weren't particularly available here in Australia. It's a fine film to revisit for me because you can kind of see what they were aiming for in this movie. There is a nice reversal that occurs in the end of the film, which plays well because the two actors involved play it just right. Tonally, it's on point, and the writing is good in that particular part. I think there's a lot of padding and a lot of, here comes another victim, bite them, they're out of the way, Eileen Daly licks her lips and goes on to the next scene. So there is a little bit of that kind of padding. And I think that the through line of the Illuminati and their cult and how pervasive it is in the authority levels of society could have been enhanced a little bit without adding too much to the budget. But Razorblade Smile, which by the way is a fantastic title for a vampire movie, works in so many ways, and it's got a bit of digital processing. There is a little bit of superimposition and CGI razor blades floating around and things like that. So it does try to do a lot with a little, and if you were watching horror films at the time, you probably would have seen this one and enjoyed it. And it's not a distasteful rewatch. Once you accept it's of its time, it's of its budget, and that some of the actors are better than other actors in the ensemble, it's an entertaining way to spend 102 minutes. I'd kind of compare it to things like Bloodlust, the Australian vampire movie, which is not quite as good as Razorblade Smile, but still has that 1990s nightclub gothy ambience about it. But rewatching this one worked for me. Probably won't do it again for a while. I may well do a top 10 list at some stage of 1990s vampire movies, because there were a whole bunch of them, and they're not just the Lost Boys and homoerotic movies like that. There were a lot of different vampire movies that came out from a whole bunch of different cultures that might be worth rewatching or watching for the first time if you haven't seen them. That then takes me to the second one, a kind of forgotten Stephen King adaptation. People remember the big stuff, that Kubrick did one, and that other people did adaptations of Stephen King, like Salem's Lot and things like that, but people don't often, when they're talking about those adaptations, and also Pet Sematary, of course, and Creepshow, but people don't talk about the Night Flier as much, and the Night Flier is the other vampire movie that I watched today. It was based on a 1988 short story, and like all good horror movies that are based on some other previous medium, this one's based on a short story rather than a novel. It's easier to fill out a short story into a movie length than it is to cut down a novel into a movie length. And that's a smart move by the creators here. And that's why a lot of the best Stephen King adaptations are based on short stories rather than novels. Again, this one was fairly low budget. It was directed by Mark Pavia, and it was shot in 29 days, which is fairly low for a special effects heavy movie like this. But they did it in Wilmington, North Carolina. It stars Miguel Ferrer as a cynical tabloid journalist called Richard Dees, who specializes in gory murder coverage. He's the guy who takes the photos of the serial killers, and it turns up in this sleazy tabloid, and he is focused on this. There's a scene in the movie where he comes upon a car accident and starts snapping photos just in case there's a story there. The cops kind of call him on it, but he tells them he's a press. He's fascinated by death, but he's detached from the emotional impact of it. And so his career, which is on a slight slide, even with this tabloid journal he works for, is all about gory, sensational, if it bleeds, it leads kind of journalism. A story comes up about murders that are taking place in small rural airports around the eastern part of the United States. And there is a black Cessna Skymaster which lands at rural airports at night. People die and the plane takes off and disappears again. And the story is actually brought to the editor's attention not by Dees himself, but by a new journalist called Catherine Blair, played by Julie Entwistle, who didn't go on to have a career in cinema at all. Because Dees has seniority, he gets the gig when he becomes interested in this potential murder, and he also has the advantage of owning and flying his own light plane.
Never believe what you publish. And never publish what you believe. Listen to me now, I don't have friends. I've got my camera, my plane, and my stories. That's all I want. And it's all I need. So if you want a friend, buy a dog.
So Dees goes on the trail of this vampire who goes by the name of Dwight Renfield, which of course is Dwight Fry and Renfield from Dracula combined together. It's a conceit the movie has, but the story doesn't. Even though Catherine Blair is kind of tagging along for part of the investigation as a secondary reporter looking into this on behalf of the editor, who is played by Dan Monahan, who was the guy in Porky's, the one who was horny and trying to get laid in Porky's. This is Dan Monahan, who is now playing a kind of not particularly middle-aged Perry White kind of character. Dees starts finding out some really creepy things about this serial killer, who he doesn't know is a vampire, and finding out information from people at the airport and people in these small towns. And he has a couple of really freaky encounters, and we start seeing the murders as well. And one of the things we find out is that this killer is mesmerizing his victims before he gets rid of them, so that they don't cause a fuss and there's no record of him landing at the airports, and so he can predate on people in and around these airports without too much hassle. And he has the ability to mentally manipulate human minds, and not only humans. We see some really freaky scenes of that going on. I'm not going to do spoilers on that. And there's also an encounter Dees has with a large dog at one of the sites of one of the murders, where it's quite clear that Dwight Renfield has ordered the dog to guard the premises and only guard the premises. And so you get a really freaky encounter that Dees has with this dog. which is a little bit Cujo-like, but it may well be a nod to Cujo. But there's a real strong sense of unease as things go on, and as accidentally Dees has a psychic connection to the vampire because of a particular photo he wanted to take at a graveyard, and so he wanted the gravestone to be knocked a little bit askew, so he kicks it, and then to make things even gorier for his photo, he cuts his finger and smears blood on the headstone, which gives him a psychic connection to this vampire, which the vampire does not want. And as the death toll accelerates, and Dees gets closer and closer to the vampire, up to and including going into his Cessna and seeing a lot of information about the vampire, it becomes a cat and mouse game between Dees and Renfield. Renfield, because of that psychic connection, realizes that Dees has a fascination with death and has an obsession with death and recording it. Renfield uses that to his own advantage. This is a really interesting little hidden gem of a movie. It takes a couple of really interesting twists at the end. The way we see Renfield at the end of the film gives us a kind of ambiguity. Is that how Renfield really is? Or is it just how Dees perceives Renfield? Because when Renfield is seen by Catherine, the other journalist, he appears totally different. Or is he just shape-shifting? It's kind of a little bit ambiguous, but it doesn't really matter. And there's some scenes at the end of the film where there's the ultimate encounter between Dees and Renfield, which have a little bit of the ambience of Herc Harvey's Carnival of Souls, but in a much more gory and confrontational and horrifying way. The lovely thing about this is you don't see the vampire for most of the film. You see him in little flashes and you see what he does. But they save the reveal towards the end of the film, and yet while the plot is progressing, you get an increasing sense of dread and sense of exactly how strange and alien and powerful this vampire is. They don't need to reveal what he looks like until right at the end. And the makeup work is pretty good on there. And the gore makeup effects are quite good as well. Now, the movie wasn't well regarded when it came out in 1997. In fact, it wasn't a financial success at all, which is a bit of a shame because, for a start, Miguel Ferrer is fantastic as Dees. He is really, his father won an Academy Award, so he's from an acting family, and his mother was Rosemary Clooney. So Jose Ferrer won an Academy Award in 1950 for Cyrano de Bergerac. And Rosemary Clooney, who made some movies herself, was a singer. His cousin is George Clooney as well, so the family obviously has talent when it comes to acting. And Miguel Ferrer, who died at the age of 61, unfortunately, was really good at certain kinds of roles. And his Dees is an interesting character, and we get a really well-defined arc from cynical, not giving a shit about anything journalist, to a man terrified and really out of his depth and really manipulated by this vampire. He delivers really well for the money they paid him. And I enjoyed watching Miguel Ferrer in this one. Yes, people remember him from RoboCop and things like that, which is a much more facile role. But in this one, he delivers a character who is our viewpoint character for the whole film that we don't like. He's an alcoholic, he's an asshole, he's sexist, he's nasty, he's cynical. He doesn't care about anybody else. He just cares about his plane, money, and his career, which he says right at the start of the film. And so you don't necessarily have an unreliable narrator, but you have an incredibly egocentric one, and that works incredibly well for the movie. It really is a hidden gem. I think it's probably one of the best 5 or 10 vampire movies in the 1990s. And rewatching it, I just appreciated how we got that escalation and how Dees moves from one location to another. And we get a greater understanding about how alienated from normal human life this arsehole of a journalist is. And Miguel Ferrer isn't ashamed or isn't at all reticent to take his character in that direction, totally, fully committing to it. So I enjoyed that one, I think, more than Razorblade Smile. Apart from anything else, it's in a much higher resolution. But between them, it was good to revisit 1990s vampire movies and not go for the obvious choices. I recommend you see them both. If you get a chance to, find a copy of each of them and watch them, because you're not going to be disappointed. They're both worth your time, though I would say the Night Flier is much more interesting because the acting and the direction and the special effects and the story arc is a lot stronger, which is not to say the Razorblade Smile doesn't have a lot of fun to it. So that's it for this time around. Thanks a lot for watching. Coming up to the end of the year, so I'm going to do my New Year's Eve 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. live stream, so that's going to be a lot of fun. So if you can, come along for that. I don't care if it's 4 o'clock in the morning in Los Angeles. Just set an alarm, get out of bed, go back to bed later, and then go out at midnight to enjoy yourself. It's going to be a lot of fun. I've got a few things lined up. I'm going to tell you what my plans are for January 2024, which include a bit of a challenge for me all the way through the month, and I'm still nailing down the exact details of that, but it's going to be a challenge over the month for me to watch movies in January 2024. So thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, hit the notification bell. You can also support the channel by donating at the YouTube app, or else you can become a patron at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. Got a couple more videos before the end of the month, and I've got some nice plans for them. One, I'm going to do a couple of Tarzan movies which are forgotten almost, and in their own way interesting, and a couple of other things that I'm still working on at the moment. Until next time, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch some kind of second tier but quirky vampire films. You're going to have a bit of fun if you do, and I'll catch you next time.